Many years ago, I had the privilege of serving on the executive committee of the British Association of International and Comparative Education alongside Ivan Hannaford. Later, sadly, Ivan died of motor neurone disease, and one of the last things that he did in his life was to finish editing the proofs of his book, Race, the History of an Idea in the West. And in that book, Ivan traced through the history of the idea of racism and race as it occurs in Western Europe, and he showed, to my satisfaction and to his, that this was not a universal idea, that the idea of race arose originally for him somewhere in the 15th century, and particularly with the forced conversion of Jews in Spain, the forced conversion to Christianity, and the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in the 15th century, and arguing that even with the forced conversion, even if people said they had converted to Christianity, there was still some doubt, and Jews who had converted were sometimes persecuted on the basis that they had not really converted to Christianity properly, whatever properly means. So the root of the idea of race, as Hannaford describes it, emerging in 15th century Spain, is that people have ideas and beliefs and knowledge, attitudes that they are born with and that cannot be changed. Thinking about, rationalizing, using logic, using one's intellect doesn't change the fact that one comes from a particular group of people, and therefore one inherits certain ideas and certain beliefs, and that cannot be changed. And that fundamental idea is the one that underpins racism. So that idea that people are born, that they inherit with their physical birth certain ideas, abilities, dispositions, competencies to be rational or otherwise, those things are not changed cannot be changed after one is born. That comes from one's heritage. And if you believe in that, then it ties you into a particular frame of mind. People can't be changed. If you disagree with them, and if you find their beliefs and abilities and dispositions so objectionable that you cannot live with them, then you're only left with the possibility of kicking them out of your country, or killing them, or enslaving them, or treating them in some way that shows that they are incapable of achieving the heights of intellectual ability that you have reached yourself. And to anybody who believes that, all I can say, frankly, is what on earth are you doing in education? This belief is the negation of everything we believe in education. We believe as educators that you can lead a person to intellectual development, you can stimulate them to review their opinions, to change their mind. This which I believe, following Hannaford, I believe this is the crucial underpinning of racism, and that is the antithesis of education. That's a denial that education can be effective. And if we are professional educators, if we are involved in education, we cannot possibly hold to that view. Now, the 1978 Declaration of the United Nations on Racism says something rather similar. It's not in exactly the same words, but it holds racism to be the belief that some people are, on account of their ethnicity, their origins, their history, incapable of certain things, and that they are therefore inherently inferior. And that there is absolutely no grounds for believing that any one group of human beings is locked into a set of beliefs or a set of knowledge or a set of dispositions that are unalterable and unchangeable, and that with the right circumstances, with the right, and I would say with the right education, anybody can reach any height that they choose. So basically, fundamentally, that's the case about racism. We need to get rid of racism, we need to be finished with racism, because this belief that someone is born with, they inherit an intellectual heritage which cannot be changed. That's absolutely a negation of everything I believe, and it's a negation of everything the United Nations believes we should be able to believe. We are human beings. So having said that, let's kick this out. Let's get rid of racism. End of discussion. But what I want you to reflect upon today is how deep-rooted this is in our ways of thinking. How deep-rooted the idea that some people are born with certain characteristics and beliefs that are unalterable, that they have some kind of personal engagement with a history that is long dead. That's very, very deeply embedded in all of the ways that we think about our heritage. In popular culture, there are television programs. Who do you think you are? You have to explore your roots. You have to know who your ancestors are in order to understand your place in history. That's a very firm popular culture view, and it's quite closely related with the idea that you inherit from your great-grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents, your personality, your identity comes from your ancestry. And if your identity comes from your ancestry, then your identity is not capable of change, because your ancestors, long dead, cannot be changed. And look at how popular exploring ancestry is, that the websites devoted to tracing family trees, to identifying one's roots, one's past family history as a way of identifying who one is, that's very much tied up with the fact that we inherit. Now, I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that we are born with an infinite range, but we're all born with equal possibilities in terms of how we can develop, and that those possible developments are not limited. We can carry on learning, we can carry on changing, we can carry on improving through our lifetime. Now, I loved my parents. I love my parents, even though they're no longer around to be the object of my love. But I do not think that I inherited that what I inherited from them physically is the most important thing about me. I inherited some chemical dispositions, some chemical arrangements, some organs and functions, and some disposition towards some diseases. But I don't believe that's actually important to my identity. What I owe to my parents, and the reason I love them, is because I shared with them experiences of living together, of learning together, and of interacting together. They formed the early years of my education, the basis of what everything else that followed was built on. It's closely tied, this notion that you're born with certain abilities, with the idea that intellectual ability is tied to the physical operations of the brain and the physical operations of the brain at all. Sure, I inherited physical characteristics of a brain. I don't think that your brain necessarily, except in exceptional circumstances, don't think that your brain necessarily sets limits to what you can know or how you can know it, so that the physical connection between intellect and the intellectual content is not the same. That what we know is cultural, it's transmitted culturally, it's transmitted through those experiences of living together. And living with my parents taught me a huge amount of what it's like to be, what it's like to be a person, what it's like to be a man, what it's like to be a woman, what it's like to know how to do things, what it's like to interact with other people. All of those things, certainly those cultural things, I learnt from my parents. Much, much more important, much more central to my identity than the genetic data that I inherited from them. So there's a very strong, in our popular culture and in our culture more generally, there's a very strong sense that what we inherit from our parents is physical, but it's also our identity. And it's not, in my view, unchangeable. It's changeable, we can learn, we can study. I don't have exactly the same ideas as my parents because I've reflected on what they said. When it comes to my grandparents, I didn't know either of my grandfathers, so they can have had no influence on me in that cultural sense. I knew my grandmothers, but I knew one of them much better than the other. I knew one of my grandmothers only slightly, and she had minimal influence on me. The grandmother that I knew better had some influence, but not a huge influence compared with my parents. And then if we go to great-grandparents, well, I know nothing about them. I know very, perhaps I could, using ancestors.co.uk or one of those websites, I could trace my ancestors back, but they had no cultural impact on me because we had no shared lived experience. So although I definitely have inherited some characteristics like height or eye colour or some of those other simple things, I do not believe that I inherited or that my identity is deeply attached to the characteristics that I was born with, as my identity has come after being born. It's not the characteristics that I was born with. Consider seriously now, you have parts of your brain which are specialised in sight, in seeing things. Parts of your brain over evolution have developed so that you can distinguish certain shapes, distinguish faces, all sorts of things. Some things are built into the brain. And similarly with language, some things are built into the brain. But you don't have any special area in your brain for reading. You don't have any special area in your brain for writing, because reading and writing are relatively recent evolutionary developments. 5,000, at the most 10,000 years ago. Before that, nothing like writing existed. Perhaps there was painting on cave walls, but writing as such did not exist. So anything that comes after writing is too recent for there to have been evolutionary developments of the brain. And so anything that's after writing, and that means cultural, religious, knowledge, understanding, attitudes, habits, all of those things that come after writing have been codified in writing. Those things are not directly heritable genetically, physically. And so we have to say, I think we have to say, look, anything that comes after that, you can learn, you can change, and the idea that they're fixed by the physical nature of your body in any way is one of the ideas that's underpinning racism, but it underpins so much more in our regular culture, popular culture, that if we're going to root this idea out, we need a thoroughgoing examination that goes much, much further than simply saying we've got to be anti-racist. We've got to reconfigure the way we think about what a person is, how a person becomes a person, how their ideas and beliefs are formed, and what they owe to previous generations. Now, Lafcadio Hearn was an Irish American, subsequently Japanese scholar who looked at intercultural events, and he said this, that Europeans go to Japan or Europeans go to China, but he was particularly interested in the case of Japan, and they see people who are venerating their ancestors. And it seems very odd to us that people would have a shrine in their house where they venerated their ancestors. I'm not sure exactly that the word worship is correct, but we as Europeans often look to the East and we say, here are signs of ancestor worship. People are venerating people generations back, and in cases of certain dynastic situations, it's very clear they thought that their identity depended on the family they were in, and you could become more noble, you could ennoble yourself by ennobling your family. And for example, you might say, well, a person who was in the next social rank above me, their great-grandparents would have been buried with great ceremony. But my great-grandparents were not buried with great ceremony, so I'm going to rebury them with the ceremony that I think is appropriate to the status that I aspire to. Europeans look at that and they say, that's a very strange set of beliefs. That's a very strange thing to do. What Lafcadio Hearn says is, don't we do exactly the same in Europe? Aren't we? We're not venerating our ancestors by putting a shrine in our house, but what we're saying is their DNA is all important. Their genetic inheritance is all important. And actually that's very deep-rooted in many cultures. It's deep-rooted to the extent that people believe that your own position, your own social standing depends crucially upon the social standing of your ancestors. Wouldn't I love to go to a website and trace my DNA, trace my ancestry back? I can show that I came across to America with the first people on the Mayflower. I can trace my ancestry back to William the Conqueror. I can trace my ancestry. It makes absolutely no difference at all to me, but see how many people think that it's of interest who their great, however many generations back, who they were, that they were connected with royalty, that they were connected with. Well, this may be, for some people, casual interest. It's just interesting to know. But for many people, it has a much more deeper significance. And what I'm saying is that it's tied to this general belief, which is the general belief on which racism rests. And if we're going to get rid of racism, it's going to take much more than a simple attack on racism. We need to attack root and branch the ideas that lie behind, and to understand how deeply entwined in our everyday thinking racism, or some close cousin of racism, is. And obviously I'm not accusing everybody who goes to an ancestry website of racism. I'm just saying that there may be people who are very clearly anti-racist and yet have beliefs that they haven't bothered to connect up with them, or they hold human beings are wonderful things. They're able to hold contradictory ideas in their head without always bothering to connect up the different ideas to see which ones connect with which. And in particular, in our intellectual area, in the area of education, one of the ideas, I've named several ideas that are relevant to education, from brain scanning to understand what people are thinking, that's to say, overemphasizing the link between the physical and the mental, through to believing that AI, artificial intelligence, and human intelligence are similar in some ways because they follow certain. Many of those beliefs are linked to this question of the physical basis of thought. But in particular, I want to point out that the sense of indigenous knowledge, indigenous implies that some ethnic group has privileged access to some certain kind of knowledge. And that again is tied up with the idea of you have to be born into a particular tradition in order to understand it fully, to understand it properly. The idea that some kinds of knowledge, some forms of knowledge, are the property of particular cultural and ethnic groups, so again, seems to me to rest on this idea. It's, again, not to say that anyone who believes in indigenous knowledge is racist, but it's a close relative of the idea that underpins racism. And of all people who opposed such an idea, Lafcadio Hearn would seem to me to be an exemplar, an Irishman who went to the United States, who spent the early part of his career as a journalist explaining to the world the tradition of New Orleans jazz and American music, then went to Japan, where he became a professor in Tokyo University and an accepted authority of Japanese culture and looking at different cultures. He lived through his life through several phases which were clearly, culturally, ethnically, quite separate. One man achieved going through those various stages, and he I think, clearly doesn't believe that you are stuck with the tradition that you're born into. And I think he might serve as a model for all of us in terms of intercultural understanding, but also understanding that we are not constrained and limited by what we were born with and our DNA.